We've put together this little journey for you as a practical guide on how to start your own meanwhile project. So we'll be touching on all different steps on the journey. What I'll be talking you guys through today. And there's a little, so obviously starting off with the idea. So that's kind of what we've gone through with you just now. Where are you at? Are you ready to go? Do you need a business plan? Is it more a community-focused idea or a business idea? What type of space do you need? And then we're coming to the second point, to the key element, finding a space. That's kind of the hardest bit of all. Finding your community. How do you find a shop, a office, a workshop, an event space, whatever it might be? And then how do you secure it? So how do you get in touch with a potential landlord and get around the kind of rather tricky issues of signing a lease, because you obviously don't want to go down slippery slopes, but be on the safe side. We'll briefly touch on business rates, a bit dry. Nobody really wants to deal with it, but it's quite important because that can be quite a big hurdle for people just starting off. So they need to be aware of whether they need to pay, whether they can afford it. I'll be talking you through the kind of hardware of the space. So what do you need to think about when setting up the health and safety, fire elements, and how to do risk assessments as a key requirement for getting the space up and running. And then we're coming to the brief but kind of fun bit of running your project. So that's obviously why you're here. The preliminaries are just getting you there, but once you're in, you can sort of have fun for the temporary time you have in the building, and already start thinking about what's going to happen after. A massive part of it all is obviously community and stakeholder engagement, whether that needs to sit at the end or right at the start. It's kind of a process throughout. You'll be having to engage with neighbors, locals, other artists, businesses, potentially contractors, people you might collaborate with. And then towards the end, we'll be thinking briefly about how to close down a space, because that's obviously an essential part of a temporary journey, because it's going to come faster than you think. How to evaluate what you've done and thinking about what's next. So let's start with your idea briefly, that you need to obviously interrogate your idea, what kind of strategies and business there are, and whether you need a business plan. That might not be the case for every venture. So on the next slide, you'll see I've prepared just a lot of different questions that kind of circle around your idea, because it's quite good to have an idea. That's kind of why we're all here. But you have to think about where you're at and what type of space you need, whether you're ready, whether you can afford it. Do you need space at all? So one of the things I've kind of heard through when you described your ideas was there's a lot of people who want to do community things or arts things, but then there's also maybe people who want to run a business from a space, because obviously someone needs to pay for it, or maybe do both. Maybe it can be art studios and selling the art. So what are you trying to achieve? Who are you trying to reach? Who are your audiences that you want to engage with? These are just some basic questions that you need to start thinking about when setting up and coming up with the idea and kind of making it a bigger one. If you've kind of thought a bit about more, you have the right people at your side to kind of take this to the next stage. Then there are questions like, what's kind of the finances? Are you ready to pay the bills? That's potentially rent. If you're lucky, occasionally you might find a space that you can get rent-free, maybe for a one-off event, but most likely you have to pay something. How much time can you invest into this project? Are you working part-time or full-time elsewhere? Do you need more space or less space, space at all at this part of your journey? Where will the money come from to run your project? Will you run a crowdfunding campaign? Do you have savings to back you up for the first 6 months? Do you plan on using your income, your revenue to fund the project? Or are you planning to take out a loan? And then lastly, maybe for someone who's more on the business side of things, do you need to go down the route of writing a business plan? That's obviously a bigger venture, but sometimes it can be helpful even when taking on a meanwhile space, which might be your first kind of touch point with taking on a space yourself at all. So let's go on to the next slide, where we'll start thinking about how do you find a space. So I think we've seen these guys in the photo here before. They're a tenant of ours, or used to be a tenant of ours, in a railway arch in South London. And what they do is slime workshops. So they found this kind of unique place to suit their needs, needed to fit it out themselves. And for them, it was less the location, but it was all about having enough space to be, messy, but also to get enough people in who are willing to travel for something very specific. So where to look, who to talk to, and what to look for are kind of the things that we'll be thinking about. So next slide, we'll see finding and picking a site. So as it says there, the hardest part of the journey comes right at the start. You might know a space already that you're keen on securing. You might have seen empty shops on the high street in the area where you live at on your evening walk with the dog, or if not, maybe just going for walks and kind of scouting the area could be a starting point. So ways to finding a vacant site could be just actively looking in the area, looking for signs of longer vacancy of commercial property, especially post-COVID. You might find that some local high streets have higher vacancy rates, especially in the retail units. You might, it's kind of a different route, you might know of spaces that are due for demolition and redevelopment, but that might not happen for a year or two. So is there a chance that you could use the space in the meantime? Or if you want to go down a kind of, I guess, a more secure route, are there any existing meanwhile use projects? So projects that meanwhile space, for example, runs that your smaller projects could fit into. Secondly, the location. Where do you need to be with your business? I mean, as much as everyone would like to be in the center, most businesses might not actually need that, or in return be able to afford it. So there is a big element of needing to compromise, because you're hopefully paying a reduced rate, a reduced rent. So you have to think about what you need to make your business work in terms of location. Does it need a customer-facing frontage? Does it need just a large kind of messy space? If it's an event space, how big does it need to be? What's the accessibility, transport? So often, and especially in places like Brighton that might have lower vacancy rates than other places in the country, we'll be looking at the fringes of the city, the less obvious, the in-betweens, that will enable us to find the spaces that we're looking for. Maybe initially less desirable locations, but also more affordable locations, and locations that allow you to experiment more than in more established locations. Next slide shows us the different types of spaces. So as I just mentioned, it's quite essential to be aware of the type of space that you need and the features it needs to have or doesn't need to have. Is accessibility for users or visitors a key element of your journey? If you want to run events, art events, is the use class appropriate? So some people might be thinking about, let's say, looking for a temporary yoga studio to just start off their journey, but that requires a particular use class, and changing the use class of a building is a kind of lengthy process. How much space do you really need, and what is affordable? So as much as we'd all like a large space, it might be enough to have a small space to start off. And because it is a temporary space, use it to experiment and then grow within that space to be able to take on another larger space, ideally in a few months. Essentially, whenever you come across a space that you find on your walk, or you'll go visit a space, you have to look at the condition the space is in. So how much work does it need? How much costs might there be involved? How much would you be willing to invest? Especially considering the short-term lease. If you need to do some investment, could there be a deal with the landlord to set off the investment in the space against, let's say, a rent-free month? Is it safe and secure? So that's obviously the landlord's, usually the landlord's liability and responsibility to make it safe and secure to let it out, but it might not be in a good state. If, again, you have to negotiate with the landlord, you might be willing to say you do some of the works and get some kind of compensation for that. Or if the space is sort of in a slightly dilapidated space, but there is still some life in it, how long does it have, how long do you have before works are necessary? Maybe bring in a second pair of eyes. Your dad, someone you know who works in the industry, who can be helpful at identifying potential issues. Same as when you look at an apartment that you want to rent or a house that you want to buy. I just mentioned, has the landlord done their due diligence? It's quite important down the line. So they need to share with you condition reports, certificates, proof of safety checks. For example, the boiler needs to be checked once a year, electricity, wiring every few years. And really important, the really important thing to think about right at the start, because that's what's going to fall on your feet at the end, is the dilapidation. So what condition do you need to hand it back in? As much as you're excited about doing up the space and doing changes and renovating, you really have to be careful around any works that might come at the end when you're already moved on and don't have any funding left to invest. We go on to the next slide. So let's say we've identified a site. The second key part of that initial journey is how do you get in touch with a landlord? And that's what we found on our meanwhile journey as a company so far is one of the hardest parts. So when we've run pop-up programs in the past, trying to initially identify the landlord and then getting in touch with them to be able to even convince them of all the benefits and the good that meanwhile use can do can be quite hard. So what are some ways of getting in touch? So there is something called a UK-wide property register in line that might happen soon, which would enable you to basically look them up. Hasn't happened yet, but hopefully it's something we might be able to see later in the year. That's been in the works for a long time. There is the land registry where you need to pay for that information. You can obviously look at signs of ownership at the actual property, or even ask neighbors, and then go and try to find out any kind of contact details, phone numbers, email addresses that you can get. If you do manage to speak to the landlord because they're at the site or because you've been able to talk to them, have your game plan ready. So the benefits that we've been speaking about in the first and second session already of short-term occupation need to be quite clear to the landlord. So how can you then come to a fair rent agreement that is better and convince the landlord of occupying the space? In the next slide, we'll see those benefits. So we've seen this illustration before, but I'm just going to repeat it quickly because it's quite essential. And I also need to mention there is a toolkit on the Brighton and Hove website where you have a landlord letter template that contains some of these arguments that can be quite helpful. So the lower costs for the landlord during the vacant periods is obviously one key element. So saving on business rates and getting some income, even not the full commercial income, is beneficial to the landlord. He's got an active occupation that keeps the space warm and secure, and most importantly, he will increase his prospects of letting the space commercially in the future by changing perception, by the user changing the area, bringing people to the space, bringing more activity to the space in general. And then there's obviously the other two elements of the tenant itself, that's you in this case, will obviously benefit from hopefully low costs and low commitments, short-term space in visible spaces, especially due to vacancy rates on the high street, with the opportunity to experiment, trial their idea, test for a few months, and hopefully grow into something that can be a step more established longer term. And for the public who might be also using the space, visiting the space, whether it's a shop, an event, or even just a service that's taken up an office, it's preventing blight, and it's maintaining or re-establishing a vibrancy in the area. It's bringing diversity, and it's part of a wider strategy of raising the profile of an area. So let's assume we've been able to contact the landlords and they're open for discussion. We have to start thinking about the lease. So I'll briefly go into detail in the next part. So you see one of our tenants from Elephant Arcade, a project where we relocated traders from the now demolished shopping center into a nearby built shopping arcade. So how do you secure a space? So initially it's obviously negotiations. You have to think about whether you offer a lease or a license, and then there's quite a lot of additional regulations that might or might not apply to you. But initially, we look into just the few points, how to secure a space, and start the negotiations. Discussing and agreeing terms is obviously the first point. You might not have done it in the past. What will help you is a template. So there is government templates, and it's also part of the pack on the Brighton and Hove website, that are kind of meanwhile use leases. So you don't have to go there with nothing. They're kind of standard leases, and they sort of will help you to make the case for what you want to do. So using those benefits that we just described, but obviously the particular terms might be very specific to the type of space, to the length of lease that you're looking for. Is it a 2-year meanwhile period? Are we just talking about a 1-month pop-up, or even just a one-off event? The whole journey that we've described so far is obviously one of big risk taking. You coming up with your idea, you wanting to go out and find a space and seeing what's going to happen. Can this sort of take off? But the lease is actually where you don't take risks. So the lease is where you stay on the safe side. Some of the elements that you'll come across in every lease, hopefully, that I've just put down here are, and that you need to be wary of, are how long is the contract for? A break clause, so that's kind of the minimum term that you have guaranteed, or / need to stay in the space. So how much do you think, how much risk do you want to go? Usually that might be 6 months, for example, that you cannot leave the space. So you need to kind of pay for 6 months, but that could also be a good time to find out if the space works for you. And then thereafter, the notice period. So that's hopefully also short enough and flexible enough for you to be able to not be stuck in something long term if it doesn't work out. As I've mentioned before, dilapidation. So what's being agreed? How do you hand back the space at the end of the lease? And obviously any payment terms, including whether business rates might be included or not, or any other charges that are payable to the landlord. You have to look at alterations that are permitted. Sometimes they might need planning. You will need and want a photographic schedule of condition. So that's going to help you prove the condition you've taken the space on in, to hand it back in the same condition. And then you also need to look at access times. So planning might limit those. And for signing the lease, when it gets to that point, bring a witness and ask as many questions as you have. So the landlord will be and should be able to explain any paragraphs. If not, if you don't understand something or you're not willing to sign, go back and review it, or take it to someone who has that specialist knowledge. There is a difference between leases and licenses. A lease is something that is where you have exclusive occupation of the property for a fixed term. The landlord has no rights to come in at any time that they want, but it gives you a secure tenure for the time. Whereas a license is something much more flexible. It's usually limited to 6 months. So you could, for a shorter period of time, just operate on a license. So whilst you might not have the same secure tenure rights, it's much more flexible. And for your short-term project, might actually just be what you need. And on the next slide, we'll see some of the other regulations that I've just mentioned that you need to be aware of that kind of go beyond just signing a lease. That will really depend on what you do in the space. Is it food and beverage? Then you definitely need to adhere to more regulations, kind of environmental health. So you'd be looking into food safety and hygiene. Noise is quite a big thing if you're running events, for example, or certain machinery. If you're running events, you might require to apply for temporary event notice from your local authority. That comes very cheap, but allows you, for example, to serve alcohol or food, or have events with a larger number of people for a limited amount of time. It is possible to get a premises license. You need a personal license for that in the first place, so that's kind of a bigger venture. But we've had that done in some for our spaces in the past. You need to be looking at insurance. So the landlord will have their insurance, but for you to be on the safe side, you'll be looking at a type of building insurance, public liability insurance, and definitely that's for sure. And depending on what type of activity you do, again, if you have any expensive equipment, you might want to be looking into content insurance. Planning restricts, for example, a certain type of usage. So there's a certain use class that is given to the space. It might limit operating and opening hours. It might limit on what you can do in the space, in addition to whatever is in the lease. You need to be looking at waste, exit routes, if there's cooking on site. And if you need planning for any of those changes, you actually need to apply for those with the council, and that can take some time. So you need to calculate kind of this whole process of signing the lease can go quite quickly, but do take your time to kind of think through what you actually need to start operating. So that's it on the legal side of things. Business rates, some of you might be aware of what that is. It's a rather dry subject, but as you will see on the next slide, it can also be a rather quick subject. So I'll just explain briefly. Business rate is basically a tax on any commercial space in the United Kingdom. Kieran, can you go to the next slide? And every one who rents a space is liable to pay these business rates. All spaces are assessed and reassessed regularly by the VOA, that's the Valuation Office Agency. That is a government office, but the rates are payable to the local councils. How it works is the government gives every space a rateable value that is determined by the type of space. So is it a retail space, is it an office space, a workspace, the size of it, the location. So central London will obviously have extortionate rates compared to rural areas, for example, and also the condition that it is in. So quite simply put, the bigger and the more central the space, the more rates you need to pay. There's tools online so you can estimate your potential rate payments. And as I said at the start, whilst this is a bit of a mystery, and you can be scared of dealing with it, if there's rates payable, for many small businesses, they might be a deterrent to taking on a space because they basically add on a large chunk of what they need to pay on top of taking up the space. And that's particularly for social projects as well, or communal projects, artists that couldn't afford them. But as we see on the next slide, luckily the government allows for certain relief schemes. So if it's a charitable project, for example, you will get 80% relief. There's discretionary relief that you might be able to agree with your local authority, but what will mostly apply to you is if you take on a small space, small business rates relief. So under £12,000 rateable value, what I just described, you won't have to pay anything. And up to £15,000, you only pay a certain percentage. So likely you get away with not paying if you're thinking about running events, so you need larger spaces. That's definitely something you need to factor in though. The application process is rather straightforward, and hopefully you get your zero bill quite quickly. So it's just something to be aware of and sort of tick off of your to-do list when taking on a space. Maybe just very briefly, when you look at a space, you might go on the government website and just to find out what the rateable value is. So to find out whether you do need to pay or not. If the space is not listed separately, it might be that the whole building that your space forms part of is rated as a whole. For example, if it's a studio or an office in a larger building, that means that no relief might apply. So you'd be liable to pay the proportional amount to the landlords. So there's some kind of occasions where it might be a bit trickier, but on most occasions, it should be rather straightforward. Next, we'll briefly, not so briefly, look into the being on the safe side. So set up health and safety, fire safety, and risk assessments. That's kind of your groundwork to get the space up and running after you've secured it, and to hopefully not have to think about these safety considerations afterwards. So to set it up, you obviously need to understand what cost is associated with the space, and ideally you do that before signing an agreement. So you think ahead and draft a basic cash flow just to see how much will be going out every month and how much will be coming in, hopefully. So thinking about the setup costs, what do you need to launch the space? What kind of renovations do you need to do initially? Can some wait and be done later once you've secured some initial revenue? What type of furniture and equipment do you need to purchase to run your operations? Think about internet setup. If it's, do you need something professional and really fast, or will your kind of normal home internet access do? Fire safety is quite an important thing. Think about signage, so people find your space. How do you brand it, and how do you get the word out? And also think about, that's something that we always recommend. So what do you put into the space, and what can you take away at the end? So the shorter the stay of your meanwhile use period, the more we'd recommend, only invest what you can take away at the end. Think about running costs. So once the space is set up, you'll have quite a lot of utility costs, from electricity and water to internet, heating, any security and safety, maintenance, potential cleaning, waste, and insurance. So similar to your home, all things that you need to deal with. And as I mentioned before, at the end, say you've changed the layout of the space, you repainted it, but it's agreed with the landlord to hand it back in a certain state, you'll need to put some money aside to hand it back as you've agreed in the lease. Also think about, as I just mentioned, how do you cash flow these different items? You might not have all the money right at the start, but you might. So will you use savings to set it up? Will you apply for a loan to get your business off the ground? Or are you budgeting future revenues into your operations? Or are you running a crowdfunding campaign? So there's quite a lot of different avenues. The health and safety considerations are on the next slide. One of the this is again talking about the services. So one thing that we notice is there's certain, when we set up our spaces, there's certain things that people can't do without. Internet is definitely, we sort of found out today, is definitely one of the top two, I'd say, if not number one. So if that doesn't work, most businesses can't operate. Warmth is definitely up there. So it might be okay for an event space or for a messy kind of workspace, but as soon as you're going down, doing a retail unit, doing up a shop or office unit, to operate and to be comfortable, you need it to be warm. Security is quite essential. You might sell expensive things, you might have expensive equipment, and think about what are the essential services and utilities, especially also if it's accessible by many different users. And similarly to when you sign the lease agreement with a local landlord, when setting up the utilities, especially considering that it's only a short-term lease that you're signing, definitely look at in every contract that you're signing the length of the contract, the minimum terms, notice periods. Rolling contracts might be more expensive, for example, for the internet, but might work better for you, because if you have to vacate the space after a few months, you might be tied into these contracts that can be obviously less beneficial for your long-term cash flow. And as we always try to do wherever possible to use local services. On the next slide, you see the I'm just going to briefly mention this. I made this much bigger than I wanted to. Fire safety it is one of the essential requirements when setting up a space. Even more so when you run a space for loads of people, or people, event space, people attending, people coming in, loads of visitors. So you started with doing a fire risk assessment. In a larger space that has several units, the landlord would have a fire risk assessment in place, so you can just do your own, and you find templates online. In a smaller space, as I said, you just look at the risks that you particularly have in your space, and that might also determine whether you need a professional fire risk assessor to come in. So think about the type of activities that you're running. Do you have any gear or machinery, any flammable materials, escape routes? Are fire extinguishers in place? You need an escape plan up on the wall. You need appropriate signage. You need, in most spaces, smoke detectors, a fire alarm need to be in place, and emergency lights on exit routes. And these will need to be checked for a professional once or twice a year. Again, if your space is part of a larger building, your landlord might have that included in a service charge, but otherwise it's your responsibility. And leaving these professional checks aside, you are also responsible for doing weekly or monthly fire checks of the fire alarm. Does that work? The emergency lights monthly, check that there is all fire exits are cleared and no furniture obstructs them. And every 6 months, you also need to do you need to get everyone out of the building and see if all the escape routes work. And on the next slide, we'll see you also need to dedicate a responsible person, just someone who kind of keeps an eye on that and is aware. If you grow or have more staff, you might decide to train up one of your staff as a fire marshal. And as I just said, it's quite important that you have to know that you are responsible for making all visitor staff and staff aware of the escape routes, for example, of any particular measures to guarantee their safety while in the space. So you don't have to give them a rundown of the whole measures in place, but just kind of where the fire extinguishers are or what to do in case of a fire. I've just posted in a link here. So the government does have quite an extensive list. I think it's 150 pages of all the different fire measures and fire safety considerations. If someone was going to take up a larger space, definitely worth having a quick look into that. Other health and safety measures on the next slide includes thinking about and ideally, obviously, doing something about it, potential tripping hazards in your operations. If you do run an event and have kind of loose cables, you might want to put down some mats or might want to find different routes for the cables. Pad testing, so testing the safety of all equipment that you have. You might be able to share that with other studios and on site. Electrical wiring safety is something that the landlord will be responsible for to do every 5 years. Food safety is some consideration you might have. How many people are allowed into your space for events to guarantee safety? Is the water drinkable or usable? Is gas on site? So you might need to inspect the boiler once a year. Are there any slipping hazards? So do you need to apply non-slip stickers? And also think about ventilation and in the spaces. So that was just a quick run through kind of the potential risks, and that's why you do risk assessments. They're quite a good exercise to identify any potential hazards on your side, evaluate the risk and implement measures. So why do you do them? You prepare for all sorts of scenarios that might occur, and you develop ways to reduce and mitigate risks, evaluate the measures that you might take, which helps you in return create safe work and leisure environments, and generally have an increased risk awareness. Some potential assessments that you might do, as I just mentioned, a fire risk assessment. If you run events, you do an event risk assessment. If you have certain equipment, tools that you use, if you work with hazardous flammable substances, you might want to think about something like a display screen equipment risk assessment if you mostly work online, and as a wider kind of part of your business plan, do a general risk assessment. So what happens, the meanwhile space might just be the first space that you take on. How does that fit into your business journey, and what happens if it doesn't work out? There's templates, so it's quite straightforward, again, as part of the pack on the website. And that was it for the health and safety. So we'll hopefully come to something more fun. So the actual fun part, running your project, I keep that rather short, actually, even though that might be the biggest part of your journey, hopefully, because as you will see, the first bullet point that I wrote down on the next slide, the fun part of the journey, you do what you do best. So you, the expert, you, the artist, you, the retailer, the startup, or the event programmer. So that's obviously why you needed the space in the first place. So running your program, growing your business, growing a following, getting people to attend your concert, whatever it might be, you kind of use that time to experiment, because that's what a meanwhile space is there for. But kind of in the back of your head, at least, stay on top of your utilities and services. Something like electricity can be quite expensive, can change quite quickly. Now we're kind of having a energy crisis, so if you need to keep the space warm, that kind of can be much more expensive than you would have estimated. So keep updating your cash flow and budget forecast to see what you can afford and what you can't. But also, again, make the most of the meanwhile that you have with a longer term in view. So whilst being in the space, and it's working, it's working, think about the longer term, what will happen after. Can the meanwhile be a little longer? Might the landlord be open to it? You start looking for somewhere else as a follow-up space. Something else to consider is if you need further support to make the most of your time in the space and advance on your journey, is that potential collaborators. Do you need professional business support for certain elements of your business, whether that's client acquisition or graphic design? And always think about whether the space that you're occupying is right for you and where you want to go. So I think Emily spoke about or Jessica sang in the first session, a stationery business that took up a shop in Blue House Yard in North London initially. And it looked brilliant because they were quite a minimal brand, and the retail unit was quite minimalist. But after a year, they realized that's actually not how their brand works. That's not where their customers are. So they then kind of downgraded or changed their space and went back to office unit. So now we kind of, you run in your space, whether that's 6 months or a year. One thing you'll be thinking about the whole time, basically right from the start, once you know you have a chance of signing a lease, or just signed it, is how do you get the word out? How do you engage community and local stakeholders? I've kept this quite short in here, but obviously I'm aware of loads of people talking about this beforehand, so we can go a bit more into detail afterwards. As you see on the next slide, I think there's kind of two elements. One is starting early, so engaging right from the start, particularly if you work with visitors, customers, event attendees, anything that's kind of more than just an office operation of a startup at kind of the back of a building. So look at who are local stakeholders, who are existing networks that you might want to get in touch with. Who are kind of neighborhoods? Are there any events you can attend and talk about your business? It could be something like a crowdfunder to raise awareness, but also have some funds and give back to the local community. You might want to invite them. I call it co-design your journey. Like, where can you involve them as part of your journey? If you're running workshops, can they suggest other workshops? Can they run workshops themselves? How can they get involved? So there's obviously a load of stuff that you can do, but you just have to consider what's right for you. But the main thing and sort of part of this journey is taking ownership, because you're basically running two operations. You're running your business or your project, but also you're running a space at the same time. So while these are intertwined, ownership is something that will make them successful. Ownership of the space can be, keeping it tidy, keeping it looking nice and attractive, and identifying with the area. We find that for a lot of our projects, what makes them successful is that they are embedded in their local area, that they get the local neighbors to come to events, to markets, or drink a beer at the craft beer bottle shop. And that will then also in return get you engaged with more people. So now we're already, as part of this brief presentation, at the end of the journey, of the Meanwhile journey. So we're thinking about closing down a project, evaluating how has it been, what stage of the project, and what's next. The closing down period is kind of a follow-up on what I've discussed earlier. So ending all service contracts, and obviously handing it back in a state that you agreed with the landlords in the first place and in the contract. Before you do that, I think you should celebrate, because you hopefully learned a lot on your journey. And if it's a bigger space, you should definitely throw a party while it's empty. Then you hand back the space. Think about how you need to hand it back. Cancel all service and utility contracts in time. So look at notice periods. Close your business rates account, and excuse me, make sure all your partners and customers know that this is ending and where you might be heading next. Evaluating what you've done. That's obviously something that Meanwhile Space do quite a lot, because when we work on kind of larger temporary sites with local authorities, we look at, as we can see on the next slide, the outputs that we deliver. So you sort of evaluate on two different levels. On your business level, you think about, was the space right for you? Was it too big, too small? Was it in the right location? Or if you had an office, do you need actually a customer-facing space? What about the affordability? So was it something that you can afford in the longer term, or is it something your business can't shoulder? And also think about, for a next space, whether that's Meanwhile again or about the long term, what would you be looking for in a space? So how do you measure impact? You find a way of keeping track of all the great things that you've made happen during the time. That's for you, for the landlords, stakeholders, and project partners. It doesn't need to be a full-blown report, but it's quite good to put kind of your story together. There can be numbers, 1,000 people came to the art exhibitions that you've run. There can be some nice photos, or even some stories that kind of create an engaging event that will help, for example, project partners to see what they've been part of. It can be a little presentation, a fact sheet, or a little kind of animation or graphic. And the values and the impact that you've had in the kind of on a wider scale, the things that you'd be thinking about are kind of social, economic, environmental, and placemaking potentially. So that might be different for every project that you run. Social impact might be something from how many how many jobs have been created, how many people have been engaged, economic, how many jobs you've had as part of your business. Maybe you've run a recycling project, or maybe you've had a growing project, so that changed the area. On the next slide, which is already the last one, one of the big questions of meanwhile use is always what stays behind. So meanwhile use is obviously a temporary occupation. So while sometimes you get a few more months or years out of your stay, when it's over, it's over. However, what stays behind is more than just a little report or some photos. You would have gained invaluable experiences, whether that's setting up a space, running a space, dealing with landlords, growing your business. You would have created invaluable experiences for people in the local area. So once you activate a space or an area, that has a massive impact on people who come and use your services, come into your shop, attend your events, and you would have also created an appetite for more. So it might be that the landlords quite like what you do. It might animate more people in the area to do something similar. And the last bit of your journey is really to think about, but that's obviously something that starts much earlier. What's next? So what's next for you? What's next for your project? Is a meanwhile use thing that works for your business. So kind of a pop-up sort of model, and you don't need much more. You don't need a permanent space. Is there another meanwhile space you can secure nearby if you can't stay? Are you maybe ready to take on a commercial lease? Can your meanwhile project, let's say that you've secured for a year or two initially, can that be something that becomes something more long-term in the same space? So where meanwhile sort of means a transition period for your business to grow. Can the space that you've left become home to another meanwhile user? And also think about, just think about your project. Did it flourish? Did it fail? Will it cease or will it expand? Was the space perfect for your needs, or can you find a similar one? So obviously that's quite a lot of different factors here, and every project is quite unique in the sense that what it does, who it wants to reach, how long it is, where it is. But hopefully that's sort of given you a little flavor of the journey meanwhile use. As part of this, we've set up a Facebook group called Meanwhile Creatives. So outside of today's session, you can continue the discussion. You can continue asking questions, potentially find collaborators, get advice on something that you've come across on this platform, which we'll be monitoring regularly. And now I think we'll have some time for questions.
Thanks, Alex. It's great. We've got quite a few questions. Paolo has given us a whole load of interesting questions to answer as well. Do you want me, maybe it's just helpful if we go through some of these one by one. So the planning use classes, they were changed last year. So they used to be really quite detailed and focused, and you couldn't really change between them. I mean, there were some quite complicated reasons that you could change between them without going for planning applications, but now they put pretty much everything under what they call an e-use class. So everything you're talking about there, retail space, art studio, performance, partial cafe use, that will all pretty much fall under an e-use class. So and really the thing with meanwhile use is that they're often not a single activity. So it's not like just a shop or just a cafe, or just, it's usually, it might be a bike workshop combined with a cafe, combined with events and activities. And what you just need to be mindful of is what is the kind of predominant use. How do you broadly stay within the kinds of activities and uses that are allowed under the e-use class? So we can find a list of those and share those with you. But it's pretty broad, and unless you're doing, it's more about managing the impact. So it's for managing things like bookmakers and pubs and those kind of activities. But the kind of things that you're talking about there mostly will fall under EU's class, so you wouldn't need change of use. Alex talked quite a lot about agreements with landlords. There's downloadable templates as part of the toolkit. It's really up to you how long you suggest as a termination notice. So I would say a week is quite short, unless you're very, very light touch in there. So you probably want to say two weeks minimum. Because also you might not be around, you might be busy and doing stuff and you have to get yourself out. It depends how much work you've done on there and how long it's going to take you to get back to the original expectation. But typically we might do a 6-month lease with a month's notice, something like that. But if you're doing a 6 weeks lease, you might say a week or 2 weeks or something like that. So it's kind of proportionate to the amount of time that you're in there usually, but really dependent on the negotiations with the landlord. Yeah, and what kind of thing they need.
About this, I was thinking, my concern was mostly about making it attractive to a landlord that hasn't thought about it. That's mostly, so I was thinking, what can I offer to a landlord to make this attractive? So that was the reason for the short notice. That was where that question came.
Yeah, and I think I mean, it's as with any kind of negotiation, it's about finding something that works for both of you. But yeah, I would say you don't necessarily need to completely bend over backwards. They're probably not going to do anything in a week that they wouldn't do in 2 weeks. So just make sure it's realistic for you. Probably what they don't want to say is, well, 2 years with 6 months notice or something like that. That's maybe not what they're looking for. But initially you could say, yeah, two weeks plus, I would say, is probably 2 to 4 weeks is reasonable, depending on how many of you are in there or what you've got going on.
A quick follow-up on this. The situation I had in mind is a commercial landlord is actively looking for a tenant. And I would like to ask, can I use the space in the meanwhile? Do you think that is that something you see that people do, or commercial landlords just going to be like, this can be too much of a hustle?
They do it. Yeah, they do it. It is about your flexibility. So I would say in that scenario, if you can get out in 2 weeks, that's very attractive for a landlord. If you can be there for 6 weeks and a day, what happens is that you reset their business rates. So they will be paying empty property rates if the space has been empty for 3 months. And if you're in there for 6 weeks in a day and you're paying the rates during that period of time, then when you leave, you reset it. So they get another 3 months. So effectively, for you being in there 6 weeks, they get 4.5 months rent rates free. So that's quite an attractive proposition. You can go on the valuation office agency that Alex was talking about. You can find out how much they're paying every month in rates, and you can say, I'm going to save you this amount of money. Because money always speaks quite loudly to people, doesn't it? So that's always a good proposition. But you were asking about whether lighter community structures such as CICs qualify for exemption for business rates. It's not mandatory. So the only way to get mandatory rate relief is to be a charity or to partner with a charity. Meanwhile Space ourselves are a community interest company, and we've done probably 70 projects now. So we're quite well versed in lots of different local authorities. And it's a real hit and miss situation over whether we are eligible for discretionary rate relief. You have to put in an application. It usually happens at a certain time of year, and then the deadline finishes, and they've allocated all their funding pot. And that information is not always available, so you don't know when that deadline is, and you don't know how much is in that pot. So it's a good idea to strike up a good, an initial conversation with the rates team to find out how their discretionary rate relief process works, what kind of things they support, when their deadlines are, ask those kind of things, and to understand what their priorities are, so you can maybe try and meet those when you're filling out the form. Some people, it's about access to space or membership opportunities or job creation or events or activities, those kind of things. But yeah, it's a bit more. So in theory, it's possible to get rate relief, but it doesn't always happen, I think is my point. And I'm just looking, does tea or cold snacks need a license? So any kind of food that isn't packaged will need environmental health. So if you're producing it on site, but you can talk to the licensing team and find out more information. It's not a very, it's not a super onerous thing. Sometimes you need to do an environmental health, food safety awareness course, and they're quite easy. They'll direct you to where that needs to be done. I think there is a bit more on this in the toolkit itself, but if there are any questions, we'd probably suggest you go off and talk to the licensing team, and then you can come back and ask us if you've got any questions through the Facebook group. Okay, and Anna's question about how important it is to be clustering for a critical mass. Anna, do you want to explain a little bit more about where you're coming from with that question?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, fantastic presentation again. I've got so many notes, my fingers gone blue. So I've had a little bit of experience of a number of projects that either have folded because one of which the council decided that we were doing so well that they would take away the discretionary rate relief and then everybody couldn't afford to stay. This situation, it's a row of retail, of dead retail, and there's a number of different landlords. And to take on one space, it feels like it might be risky in that to take one space in the middle might not be enough. So one question is, in your experience, do you think that critical mass is important? Because this isn't one empty shop in a row of shops, it's a whole row of empty shops and other businesses. So the critical mass, yeah, how important is that? And then my other concern is, having also had the experience of being a meanwhile tenant in a pretty awful area, and then the success of the meanwhile use put the land values up so that then we couldn't afford to buy the building. The idea being that our exit strategy was to buy the building, but because we'd done so well at doing the economic regeneration, we then couldn't afford it because the land values went up. So it's those kinds of questions in your experience of, obviously you've done it many more times than I have, just to get some of your thoughts.
Yeah, this is sort of a wider sort of placemaking regen impact perspective, isn't it? So I would say that in our experience, it is better to cluster.
Yeah, okay.
But if you're looking for the wider impact, but that's because for us as Meanwhile Spaces as an organisation, our mission, our vision is about creating better places through meanwhile activity. And so one use doesn't necessarily impact the wider neighbourhood on a longer term basis, but maybe 3 or 4 different activities might. However, my general view is that action is better than perfection, and that once you start with one, you then, particularly where you've got multiple landlords, private landlords with differing interests and dispersed locations usually, it's better to get into one rather than waiting for multiple agreements to line up, because actually that's unlikely to happen. But once you're doing something in one space, usually the neighboring spaces might then go, oh, okay, I understand now what you're trying to do. That sounds good. But yeah, getting a run is quite difficult to get everything lined up at the same time, I would say. But it does make a difference, and it does generate impact. But having slightly different offers in those rather than the same activity, and thinking really what activities will complement what's there already, is a good thing. The second part of your question, sorry, I missed that bit.
It's about if your exit strategy involves
purchase. So we now obviously have wider powers through through, I forget what it's called now, but where you can community right to buy, where you can register a community use with the local authority, and that allows you 6 months of time to raise finance. It sort of stalls the process. Again, these are quite challenging topics. It's a bit of a wider topic maybe, but it's quite a challenging conversation of, you know, if you're then stalling future development, how is that perceived? What are the kind of wider benefits of doing that? Is it a collaborative process? How, you know, where does the funding come from for that? All of those kind of things are kind of really big ticket questions. I don't have the answers to those. I think it's the wider conversations. It's worth looking at our work in Hastings, the Hastings Commons, on that kind of question, which has been about purchase of buildings and using them as leverage for community-led development, longer term development, and mortgaging those and buying the next one, and that kind of process of doing that. If you're interested in that I can talk to you about that offline.
Thank you.
I'm aware that we are at time now, but Mark has got a question and we started a little bit late. So if you guys are right to hang on for a few minutes, then we are too. Mark?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, sorry. There's a specific building that I'm really interested in using that I've seen that is empty, but it's owned, I think, by Network Rail.
Okay.
I know, I've heard that they can be a bit tricky. I'm just wondering who the point of contact is that we should be approaching in terms of like landlords, what their kind of title is, whether the safety element that was being referred to earlier about fire checks and that sort of thing, is that still relevant if it's not going to be a public access space? And the third thing was in terms of finding out their business rates, I think it was saying that it's not yet public, that information, that system, or is it? I didn't quite understand that.
Business rates is public, yeah. In terms of asset ownership, so who the landlord is, that is due to be public, but it was only really it's something we've been lobbying for many years, and was only announced last week. So that should be coming on board. Again, it's government led. Who knows how effective or useful it will be? We'll see. Network Rail, we've worked with for many years. They are really a very tricky beast. It's like steering a massive tanker, and trying to get anything out of them is quite challenging. They have asset managers so they have kind of zoned regional asset managers. So in London, they'll have parts of Southeast will be one particular person, and finding that person is important. It might well be with the Archco now, because Archco bought a lot of Network Rail.
It's not an Arch, actually. But,
okay, so it'll probably still be with Network Rail, and they have sort of split, their property team has split. So it is a bit of digging, I think, really, finding someone in Network Rail that you think maybe even if there's a to-let board, contacting that number and going along with the notion that you might be a commercially paying tenant until you can find the right person and put in a proposal to them. That's often the way, is like convince them there'll be money coming along, and then they're a bit more open, and then actually when you kind of get to it of the negotiations, you can say, well, actually my suggestion is this. That's kind of a good way with Network Rail, because they're very business focused. If it's literally just for you, then you don't need to necessarily worry about being too stringent with those checks, because you're not inviting the public in. However, if it is a Network Rail property, they would want to see all those checks, because they protect the railway, and so they're much more stringent than perhaps other landlords might be. And it's obviously good for your own safety to make sure that you have the right insurances, and if anything happens within that space, that you're covered off. But yes, the levels of of sort of risk assessment and health and safety that you go to will very much depend on who's using the space and how many people and what it's being used for. Cool. Are there any other questions? No. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else, Alex, that you would like to cover before we go, or Kieran?
Thank you for your patience at the start.
I think it all worked out in the end. In the way, it was nicer to get to know everybody and what everyone's here for. So please do join us on the Facebook forum. Did you want to mention a little bit about the Meanwhile Foundation membership, or did you want to come back to that later, Alex?
No, we can briefly mention that. So as part of these webinars, we're giving away 10 memberships of the Meanwhile Foundation for a year. They do not only include a public liability insurance that will cover you off in your space use for that part of the insurance, but they also include loads of tools, templates, and we're obviously constantly kind of extending what's on offer there. So that it's kind of 10 memberships we're giving away. It'd be good if people could just, let's say on the Facebook group or to info@meanwhilespace, just drop us a quick message if you're interested, and kind of just 3 sentences with your proposal of what your Meanwhile project would be, because we're obviously interested in giving it to people who can make use of it within the next year, and then we'll get back to you really quickly.
Great. So we hope to see you over on the Facebook page for any questions that you might have. Doesn't matter how big or small they are. And if you have any different kinds of questions, then please contact us at Meanwhile Space, and we'll direct you as and where is needed. So thank you so much for everybody for joining us. Really great to meet you and find out more about your projects, and best of luck with it all.